name is RENATA'S. I'm 36 years old, and I get paid to imagine the worst thing that can happen in a room full of people and then quietly make sure it doesn't. I run logistics and crisis management for large events, weddings, galas, conferences, the kind of night where hundreds of people show up expecting magic and never once think about what is holding the ceiling over their heads. Mine is the part nobody sees, the part that only becomes visible the one time it fails. And for most of my life, my family has treated the thing I am best at in the world as a personality flaw. Welcome back to Rose Untold Stories. This is the place for people who spent years being told they were difficult, when the truth is they were just the only one paying attention. If you have ever been the person who saw it coming and got told to stop being negative, stay with me tonight. You are going to want to see how this one ends. My mother is Charlotte. My younger sister is Camille. And the story they have told about me for as long as I can remember is not that I am stupid or that my work is small. It is subtler than that, and it is worse. In their version of me, I was the difficult one, the person who found a problem in every good idea and always listed what might go wrong. Nobody insults you, they just roll their eyes when you speak. They have a little smile they exchange. When you raise a concern, a here she goes smile, and after enough years of it, you learn to say less, and then less, and eventually you stop bringing the list at all and just watch quietly to see if the thing you saw coming shows up. It usually shows up. That is the part they never sit with. Because here's what my family calls being negative. A venue tells me the evacuation route runs through one narrow corridor, and I ask what happens if that corridor is blocked. A vendor cannot produce a certificate of insurance, and I decline to book them. Which brings me to my sister's wedding. Camille was marrying a man named Ross, from a family with a great deal more money than ours, and my mother had decided that this wedding was not a wedding. It was an audition. It was the one night the Vances got to prove to Ross's family that we belonged in the same room as them, and nothing was going to be allowed to look less than perfect. They booked Ashcombe Hall. It is a beautiful old building, genuinely beautiful, and it is also more than 100 years old, with an aging electrical system and a basement that sits low against a river. I know this because I offered, for free, to build them a full plan. I did it because I love my sister, and because I would rather push too hard than wish later that I had said more. She hired a company that was famous on social media for weddings that photographed like fever dreams, run by a man named Preston, who had a great many followers and, I would learn, considerably less interest in the boring parts than the beautiful ones. I found out at the rehearsal dinner. Camille stood up and introduced Preston to the table, like he was the guest of honor, her famous wedding planner. Preston, gracious enough, looked down the table at me because someone had mentioned I worked in events too. He asked, with a little smile, whether I was some kind of planner as well. Before I could answer, my mother answered for me. She put her hand on my arm and told me warmly in front of everyone, "Don't ruin this." And my sister laughed and said something light about letting the real professionals handle it this time. I smiled because I had spent my whole life smiling through moments like that. Mr. Holloway had been standing near the end of the room with the weekend schedule in his hand. He looked up when he heard the exchange. Then he said, mildly, that I had sent Ashcombe Hall a written assessment of its electrical system, evacuation route, and overhead load restrictions months earlier. He added that it was one of the more thorough documents the hall had received in years, and that his staff had already used parts of it to update their internal procedures. The table went quiet in a way it had not been a second before. My mother recovered fast. She always does. She said how nice, thanked Mr. Holloway, and changed the subject. But I saw Ross's mother look at me for a moment, as if she were reconsidering something. I did not say anything else that night. Heavy rain was coming the night before the wedding. I want to know who is here with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me the city you are watching from and the hour where you are. I would especially like to hear from the people who have sat at that exact table, smiling, holding a thing they knew, because they had learned that saying it out loud only ever made them the problem. I told myself it was not my job anymore. They had a famous planner. They had made their choices. I was just a guest now. I did not know yet that by sunrise the wedding would lose its venue, its planner, and almost every part of the original plan. The rain came in around midnight, the night before the wedding, and it did not let up. I was awake for most of it. The way you are awake when you have told people something and been laughed at, and you are lying in the dark listening to the exact weather you warned them about. I told myself I was not going to say anything. I told myself it was not mine to fix. I told myself a lot of things. At 6 a.m, my phone rang. It was my mother, and her voice was doing something I had never heard it do. It was frightened. Ashcombe's basement had flooded in the night. Water had reached the electrical room and compromised the main panel. The fire alarm system could no longer be verified. Water had also reached the lower end of the building's only usable evacuation corridor, leaving it unable to safely handle 180 guests. Rain had entered through part of the old roof above the ballroom as well, close to the timber points supporting Preston's suspended installation. Mr. Holloway would not clear the ballroom for use until the electrical system and overhead attachments had been inspected, and Preston's company had withdrawn. Their insurer would not allow the crew to continue working inside a building without electrical and fire clearance. Relocating an entire wedding was outside Preston's contract, and he wanted a second, much larger fee before he would even discuss it. When Camille refused, his team packed what equipment they could safely remove and left. Preston did not disappear into the night. He did something more ordinary and, in a way, more revealing. He followed the narrowest possible interpretation of his contract and stopped answering calls that were no longer profitable. The beautiful part walked away the instant it stopped being beautiful and started being work. The guests were going to begin driving toward Ashcombe Hall in a few hours. Some were already on the road, the out-of-town ones, the early ones, and my mother, on the phone, asked me to do something I will not forget as long as I live. She did not ask me to save the wedding. Not first. First, she asked me to keep it quiet. She asked whether I could write a temporary operating plan that would allow the ballroom to reopen before the engineer arrived. She wanted Ross's family to be told that the flooding was limited to the basement and that the rest of the building remained usable. She wanted me to put my professional name behind a room that had not been inspected and make it sound safe. I said no. I said it calmly because panic is a luxury I do not get in my job, and this had become my job somewhere around the word flooded. I told her I would help. I told her I would not hide anything, and I would not put anyone in that ballroom, and if she wanted my help, she was going to get it on my terms and only my terms. Then, standing in my kitchen at 6 a.m. with my contingency bag already beside the door, I told her the terms. The ballroom was finished, nobody was setting foot in it. The wedding was moving to Merrill Botanical Garden, the first alternative listed in the plan Camille had rejected months earlier. I had already spoken with Merrill during the original planning process. Their glass house and adjoining pavilion could safely hold all 180 guests, but we could not add another person. The expensive spectacle was gone. The flower wall, the suspended installation, the fever dream, none of it could survive the timeline. Local vendors would be paid in advance, because nobody gives you a miracle on a rainy Saturday morning on the promise of a check. And every guest would be told the truth. A weather-related safety problem. A change of venue. A new address. No cover story. There was one more term, and my mother went quiet when I said it. I told her I was not doing this as her daughter. I was doing it as a professional, under a contract, for my standard emergency management fee. Because I had spent years anticipating their problems, cleaning up their decisions, and being laughed at for it. I was done being the daughter they could dismiss and then call at 6 a.m. If they wanted the difficult woman now, they were going to hire her. My sister got on the phone. She was angry first. Of course she was. Because I was dismantling the wedding she had pictured for a year. But somewhere in the middle of being angry, she ran out of options. There is a particular silence a person makes when they realize the only door left is the one they slammed. Camille signed what I sent her. She hired me at 8 a.m. on her wedding day. Then I went to work. Marrow had an opening because a corporate garden luncheon scheduled for that morning had canceled when the storm intensified. That was luck, and I will not pretend otherwise. but Merrill's director answered my call because we had already spoken months earlier. She had the capacity figures, insurance requirements, and vendor access notes because I had asked for them when I wrote the original plan. Luck opened the space. Preparation allowed us to use it. The first thing that went wrong happened before I had even left my kitchen. My phone lit up with a call from an uncle who had driven in from 3 states over and was standing in the Ashcombe parking lot in the rain, looking at a dark building with temporary barriers across the entrance, asking me where everybody was. The early guests were already arriving at a venue that no longer existed. I had people en route to a place I was trying to abandon, and no reliable way to reach all of them at once, so I did the only thing you can do. I turned one man in a parking lot into a checkpoint. I gave him the new address, told him where to stand, and asked him to redirect every car that entered until one of my assistants could replace him. I made him a traffic controller in the rain. And he did it. That is the thing about a crisis. Almost everyone becomes useful the second you give them a clear job. I am not going to tell you the rest of it was smooth, because it was not, and I do not trust versions of these stories where the competent woman waves a wand. It was ugly and fast, and I got things wrong. The wedding already had chartered buses booked to bring guests from a central parking area to Ashcombe. I redirected them to Merrow while the drivers were already preparing their routes. One of them followed the original directions out of habit and delivered a full bus of Ross's relatives to the far side of Ashcombe. I spent a long stretch on the phone guiding a driver I had never met through a turnaround on a partially flooded road while his passengers grew restless behind him. At one point, I stood in a wet parking lot with a phone against each ear, one connected to the driver, the other to the caterer, who did not want to release food to a new venue without revised paperwork. I had a bad stretch there where I nearly lost it. Then I stopped, breathed, and solved it the boring way. One call at a time. The bus made the turn, the paperwork was signed. The food was released. The hardest part was not the logistics, it was my sister. Camille had planned to get ready at Ashcombe. Her dress, her hair, the whole slow, beautiful morning of it. Everything was supposed to happen in a bridal suite that was now sitting above a flooded basement. Somewhere in the middle of the move, she came apart. Not about the flower wall, not about the money. About the fact that the wedding she had built in her head for a year was gone, and she was going to get married in a borrowed glass house after putting on her dress in a garden office. She stood in the rain crying, and she was my little sister, and I had almost no time to spare. I told her she could grieve the wedding she pictured later, tonight, next week, for as long as she needed, but right now she had a garden full of people who loved her, and a man waiting to marry her at the end of it. The only job left was to go be married. I told her the pictures would not show the flower wall, they would show her face. And her face was the only thing anyone had actually come to see. She wiped her eyes and went. That was the most sisterly thing I had done in 20 years. It lasted about a minute, and then I was back on the phone with a florist. We saved the flowers that were already cut, the real ones, because I could not save the wall. But I was not going to let 100 good stems die in a flooded lobby. Then it came down to the light. That was the last race. The whole plan hinged on getting the ceremony under the glasshouse roof while the sun was still low enough to come through the western panels, and we were badly behind. Every delay of the day had stacked itself against that one window of gold. I had a garden coordinator holding the aisle, an officiant checking his watch, a bus still unloading, and only a sliver of good light left. I made calls I would not make on a normal day. I cut the pre-ceremony photo session. I shortened the processional. I walked my sister to the edge of the aisle myself, faster than any bride should have to be walked. The ceremony began just as the rain weakened, and the last warm light came through the glass. Camille married Ross surrounded by people who were safe, dry, and there. Nobody called me to a microphone. There was no moment where the room turned toward the woman who had saved the day and applauded. I spent the ceremony standing at the back by the door, where I always stand, watching the exits and counting heads. Some relatives, I learned later, genuinely believed the whole thing had come together by luck, that it had simply worked out, that these things have a way of working out. They did not know what I knew. I did not learn it myself until the reception was already underway. My phone buzzed. It was Mr. Holloway from Ashcombe Hall. He had learned that Preston's crew had added one final suspended section after the approved rigging plan had been reviewed. They had attached it to an unapproved anchor point beside an area of hidden decay. The timber was already carrying more weight than the Hall's guidelines allowed. When rainwater reached the weakened section, the overloaded connection tore free. A section of the installation came down across the exact area where the guest tables had been positioned on the original plan, the tables where Ross's relatives would have been sitting, the tables where my family would have been sitting. I stood at the edge of a botanical garden with my phone in my hand and the sound of my sister's reception behind me, and I read the message 3 times. The flooded basement, the compromised electrical system, the unusable evacuation route, the overloaded ceiling connections. Every risk I had written into a plan my sister had dismissed had arrived in the same building on the same day. I did not go into the reception and announce it. That is the part one am most proud of and the part that is hardest to explain. I let them dance. I put my phone in my pocket and stood at the back, watching a room full of people be alive. That was enough. The job was never to be thanked. The job was for the thing not to happen. And it had not happened. Ross's family found out quietly later that night. What disturbed them was not that the elaborate wedding had fallen apart. It was that someone had tried to hide a safety problem from them right up until I refused. My mother tried, even then. She began telling the older relatives that the family had all pulled together and figured it out, that we had gotten through it as a family. This time, my sister did not let her. Camille did not do it in front of everyone. There was no microphone, no dramatic interruption, and no speech designed for the room. She did it later in a small side room, with Ross's parents, my mother and me, because Camille had asked me to be there. My sister said it plainly. She said the family had not figured it out together. Then she said that the reason no one had been sitting beneath that installation when it fell was that I had refused to let them enter the room. My mother's face, when the story she had been telling for 36 years would not hold, is not something I enjoyed. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I did not. I felt tired, and I felt something close to grief. Because it should not have taken a flooded building and a collapsed installation for my own sister to say my name and the word warned in the same sentence. But she said it, and my mother for once could not write over it. She did not suffer a public humiliation, she kept her evening, but she could no longer go home and turn it into the story where everyone had rallied equally. The person she had always counted on to absorb the consequences had stopped absorbing them. The next morning, I was at Marrow, settling the last vendor payments when Camille found me. She had something in her hands. It was my original emergency binder. The printed one I had made for free months earlier, the one she had dismissed and shoved into a box in the garage. She had gone home after the reception, found it, and read the whole thing. She told me that nearly everything we had scrambled to do the day before, the backup venue contact, the transport rerouting, the vendor list, the capacity figures had already been written down. I had not invented the entire rescue that morning. I had reconstructed, from the digital working copy in my car, a plan that had already existed on paper. Camille told me she had stopped on the final page. At the bottom, beneath all the contingencies and phone numbers and worst-case scenarios, I had written one sentence by hand. I hope none of this is ever needed. She said that was the line that broke her. She had spent her whole life thinking I wanted to be right, that I collected problems to prove a point. Holding the binder, she finally understood that I had never wanted to be right. I had wanted to hand her a plan she would never need. Being right was the outcome I had hoped to avoid, and it had found us anyway in a ballroom full of empty tables. She apologized. And I want to tell you what I did with that apology, because it is the part that matters. I accepted it. But I did not pretend it repaired everything. I did not tell her it was fine, because it was not fine, and I had spent too much of my life telling people it was. Saving one wedding did not erase years of that here she goes smile. One honest conversation did not pay off 2 decades of being dismissed. I told her I was glad she had finally read the plan. I told her I loved her. and I told her I was not going to pretend the past had disappeared because the previous 2 days had ended safely. She did not argue. To her credit, she did not try to rush us back to normal. She paid my invoice in full. And she did something I had not asked her to do. The money she recovered from the canceled installations and unused decorations went toward covering the losses of the small vendors who had rearranged their entire Saturday for us. I did not tell her to do that. She thought of it herself, which told me more than the apology did. A few weeks later, Ashcombe Hall contacted me. They wanted my help shaping the public account of what had happened and advising them on reopening the ballroom. They wanted the explanation to focus on the successful relocation rather than the failures that had made it necessary. I said no to that version of the story. I told them I was not interested in becoming a reassuring example for a building that had allowed its safety systems and inspection procedures to fall behind. But I offered to consult for them on 2 conditions. They would repair every issue identified in my report and obtain independent certification before reopening the ballroom. And they would compensate the staff members who had worked through the flooded weekend, the people who had spent the morning pumping water and securing the building while Preston's company left. They agreed. That work was more satisfying than a public thank you would have been. My family did not transform. My mother has never directly apologized. She probably never will. But the last time the family planned a small holiday gathering and I raised a concern about the timing, nobody exchanged the smile. My mother went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Renata has probably thought about this more than we have." That was all. Small, late, and imperfect. But it was the first time she had allowed my caution to enter the room without turning it into a flaw. A while after the wedding, Camille sent me a photograph. It was not one of the posed pictures. Someone had taken it at Marrow after the rain stopped. The guests were standing beneath the clearing sky with their arms around one another. No flower wall. No historic ballroom. Nothing designed to look like a fever dream. Just people. Alive and together. On the back, Camille had written, "I lost the wedding I imagined. But because of you, I didn't lose anyone who came to it." I put the photograph on the wall of my office. Not because it proved I had been right. This time I had been right. And being right had never been the reward. I put it there because someone in my family had finally looked at what I do. The invisible, unglamorous work of imagining the worst so it does not happen, and understood that it was not negativity. It was me loving people in the only language I had ever been fluent in. Have you ever seen something coming and been called difficult, right up until you were the only one prepared for it? Tell me what happened. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe to Rose Untold Stories. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.